Since we couldn't accommodate everyone, we thought the best way to close would be a panel of our workshop leaders who are going to share key takeaways from their sessions. I'd like to welcome these leaders to the stage as I introduce them. Erica Matsumoto of NYC Media Lab, Cramer of Columbia's Data Science Institute, Andrew Nicklin of GovEx, Jake Porway of DataKind, and Susan Kish, one of the founding members of the Data for Good Exchange. Afterwards, we'll hear from Vicky Cerullo, the Data for Good Exchange conference lead, who will wrap up our day. But first, let's welcome our panel.
Great to be here. Great to see some familiar faces. Thank you very much, Julianne. And just like the rest of the workshops, this will be a little bit sort of real time in terms of how we're going to structure the next 40 minutes. So what we're going to do, just to give you a highlight, we're going to spend the first portion of it getting each one of those workshop leaders to do a debrief. Share with us what their key findings and their key takeaways were from their respective sessions. Because I can tell you, each one was not just full, but each one was really quite different. The second thing we'll do is we'll have a conversation and start to identify what were the key themes. You know, what are the common things we've seen? Because there really were some really interesting themes that came out across all four of them. And we're going to close about thinking about takeaways, actionable next steps, things that we can leave from today from those workshops and really apply either today, tomorrow, or in the future going forward. So we're going to do this chronologically. So that means, Andrew, you get to go first. Andrew Nicklin's the Director of Data Practices at Johns Hopkins Center for Government Excellence and was our leader for our first workshop.
Yeah. So
if you want to stand up, you can. If you want to sit, that's also fine.
I'm going to cower in my seat very comfortably.
Outstanding.
Thank you for that introduction. And thank you to D4GX for hosting the workshop. When we sort of put it in as a proposal, I was hoping it would get through, and I was glad it did. And essentially what we wanted to do was surface a toolkit that we've been working on for quite a number of months. And when I say we, I'm representing a group of 4 or 5 other people who really, without them, I certainly would not be sitting here. So myself at the Center for Government Excellence, and Miriam McKinney, who's one of my colleagues at the Center for Government Excellence, and then Joy Bonaguro, who is the former Chief Data Officer for San Francisco, and Dave from Data Community DC, and Jane Weissman from Harvard. So we have a good crew that have put this together. And essentially what we wanted to do was build a toolkit that allowed governments to assess or characterize the risks around the algorithms that they're using. And so this meant tailoring a tool that was reasonable for government employees and perhaps a little bit different from what most people are used to. And our workshop today was really around getting that out and surfacing it and starting to have a conversation about it. So thinking about the projects that this toolkit would be applied to. And then also thinking about, well, where did we succeed in building the toolkit very well and where did we not, and what can we do to improve it? And I guess we'll get into that towards the end of this, but one of the things we were very much looking for was a lot of feedback from the group in the room, and we had, I think, a tremendously good dialogue about that. But essentially what we're trying to do here is equip government leaders with the tools to understand the algorithms that they have at their fingertips and what harm and what good they can have.
Excellent. Were there any key quotes you'd like to share or key sort of things that were surprising to you?
I mean, I have a whole 2 or 3 pages worth of notes here. I don't think I can go through it.
Up already?
Yeah, we're very quick. Well, see, we had the first session, so we had plenty of time to sit around and ignore all the other workshops.
All right, well, that reduces the pressure on you because you just got out of yours, so that's good.
Yeah, so I mean, many of the things were around the kind of feedback that we got about the toolkit, about whether it was not nuanced enough, or maybe in some cases whether it was too nuanced. Nearly universally, I heard, and partly that's my own filter applying this, but nearly universally I heard this is a very needed thing, which was really great for me to hear because we've been working on it for a long time. Any specific quotes that I can find from here?
You had a great quote.
I did. What was my great quote?
Your quote said, all data is biased.
Yes.
All algorithms are biased.
Right.
And actually, all people are biased.
Which now we need to add because we didn't have that in the original assumptions. And now
Yeah.
that last one we got to put in.
That was a good zingy quote.
Yeah.
That was good.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Let's go to workshop number 2. And this is Jake Porway, who, does anybody in this room not know of who Jake is?
Please, I hope many, yeah, for your sake.
So as a founder and director of for DataKind since 2012, you've been a leader in this market for years. And the line was out the door for your workshop as well. So how would you summarize it? What were your key takeaways?
Overrated, clearly.
It was really fun. And can you do
I
the clap
do.
thing, please?
I'll just
Everybody
say,
have to-
if those who've been in the Occupy Wall Street or community involvement or design groups, the old clap once if you can hear me, clap twice. I think that might have been maybe the best contribution we gave to that room. So people really appreciated that.
And we all clapped.
And everyone clapped. It worked great. But I appreciate that kind intro. Thank you. I really have to say that truly was, I should say this session was around Data for Good 2025. So when we started talking about the first Data for Good conversations in 2010, data science had just come out. There was a question about what we could do to apply it for good, what would that take? And of course, in the 8 years that have transpired, huge efforts have occurred, as evidenced by everything you see around this conference. And so we wanted to facilitate a conversation with leaders in the space about where we've been and what's working well, and more importantly, what should the next 8 years look like? How do we go to the next level? And I say co-facilitated because, as kind of an intro as that was, this whole workshop really hinged on the people who facilitated it, which were not me. I just got everyone into a room. But major credit to Elizabeth Grossman from the Microsoft Cities team, who's also a DataKind board member. Mark Hansen runs the Brown Institute on Media and Innovation, who was there. Evan Tuchowski from the Rockefeller Foundation, looking for these faces, but they're out there. Aaron Stein from 2 Sigma runs their data clinic. And, oh my God, why am I blanking on my fifth? Matt Gee, of course. Oh my God, Matt Gee, talking about founders of the Data for Good movement. Everything from Bright Hive to Data Science for Social Good to University of Chicago stuff. So really, they truly ran the workshop. And I say that not just to give kudos, but also because I think that was really how we wanted the workshop to work, was this should be people in the community, talking to people in the community about what gaps exist, what opportunities we've seen, and how to move forward. So that was the setup. And you probably got a lot more pull quotes than I did. I say we went for quantity here, and I think there had to be about 500 Post-its generated in the first session, so we haven't even fully synthesized everything yet. But I think the thing that's been a few of the themes that came out for me, if I'm not jumping ahead too far, that I thought were great were, people seemed to have incredibly engaged conversations. And I heard a lot of conversations about, in particular, accessibility to understanding what it is we're all doing, whether it be the data sets, the algorithms, between technologists and non-technologists. So everyone in this room probably plays that interesting intermediary role. How can we be playing that more? Because as this stuff spreads, there's more and more need for that translation. Again, some of these may not be as surprising to you, but I think hearing them codified was really helpful. Equity came up a lot, right? If this is the theme of this, this conference is our Data for Good. Who is the our? Because if it's everyone in this room, probably doesn't look a lot like all the constituencies that we want to see represented in a world of Data for Good. So how do you change that? And then one thing I love, there were so many points, but someone said, how do we get out of the curse of pilotitis? Which is that there's all these, I think the first necessary step towards building this awareness was, let's do some projects, let's show people what this looks like. But to make a sustained effort where you've got NGOs doing data science themselves, governments running this, or other places where so data science is in the social fabric, we have to move beyond just the one-off project. How do we start investing in repeating the stuff that's worked or getting that capacity in there? I can't do justice to as big a conversation as this was in just a few key points, but those were some of the things that I was really heartened to hear, was people saying, how do we move this to the next level? Beyond just a project or one volunteering program to shifting some major change in the sector.
And the phrase that came up around this, the question of equity and allowing non-data scientists to understand that, was that somebody said the phrase of, do it so that you can explain it at the Thanksgiving dinner. Right?
Yes.
So it actually becomes something we all can really understand. And that expression already got picked up in other workshops through the day, and I think will probably be one of the things that resonates, because we all understand what that means. It means speaking to an audience at a really wide range and forcing yourself to understand it at a simple enough level to communicate it effectively.
We called it hashtag Thanksgiving rule, if you're following it.
Yeah.
Hashtag Thanksgiving rule.
Yeah.
So it's already gone. It's already out there. Oh,
Thank you for starting that.
outstanding. All
So
right,
Thanksgiving
everybody
rule.
got
Yeah.
that? Hashtag Thanksgiving rule. Excellent. Thank you. And then workshop number 3 was about community, and Catherine brought in a really interesting real-life case for us. So Catherine, can you give us some context?
Absolutely. So community challenges with data, we are so excited about just being able to bring it here and the results. So this is based on over 3 years of work funded by the National Science Foundation through the Northeast Big Data Innovation Hub, and let me just say that it was so crowded that even our funder was not allowed in the room, which,
And is that good or bad?
well, interesting. Frustrating for him, but and so this is based on work that we've been doing that has been funded for the last 3 years on data literacy, along with the New York Hall of Science and New Knowledge, great partners, all of them, on connecting communities of need with data literacy, right, and bringing data literacy into everybody's homes and lives. And we've made good progress, but a lot of these conversations have been conversations at kind of a high rarefied research kind of level. And we kept looking for an opportunity to actually do some more kind of on-the-ground work with a community-based organization. And through some work that the New York Hall of Science is doing with the community of Corona, we had a good relationship with an organization called Elm Corps, which has been around for 53 years, which for a community-based organization is pretty amazing. And they do a lot of different kinds of work. Right now, they've just gotten a very nice, I think it's $1.2 million piece of funding for opioid abuse prevention work. They have a mobile unit. And they brought in 2 specific challenges that they really wanted help with. One, the director of education outreach sort of plopped down on the table 1,000 paper surveys, pre and post testing of opioid abuse prevention work that they're doing in schools, and really needed feedback and actual concrete next steps. And she got a lot of them on now what do I do with this, in order to make it something that could be used to show impact for their funders and for their principals that they're working with. And then Saida Dunstan, who's the executive director of Elm Corps, she brought in a larger kind of global enterprise-wide problem of, Elm Corps has been around for 53 years. We want it to be a data-driven enterprise. How do we do that? And so we broke out, actually I learned from also not being able to get into Jake's workshop, to take, so we had 2 problems. We took half of the group into a separate room where they could really jump into the survey question, and then the other people stayed in the main room and talked about really how to turn Elm Corps into a data-driven enterprise. And some of the quotes, Saida was saying that just amazing feedback, and the people's interest in supporting the work, how excited they were, and applying their lens and willing to be a part of it. And by the way, she said she knew of many more nonprofits who could benefit from this kind of thing. So we're hoping that this does become more of a thing. And Layla was also same thing, talking about the level of excitement and how many people were really energized with the idea of working with young people on opioid abuse prevention, public health, real challenges in general. And I'm in total goosebump mode, and I'm still in total goosebump mode. I just, this is a huge step for our work, and it's happening again, goosebumps, for us to be able to bring these particular challenges, for Elm Corps to bring their challenges to the amazing minds that are assembled here today. So.
It was a great conversation, especially when I went to the session that Saida did, where she was talking about, okay, so I've increased my funding by 36%. That's fabulous. But if I can't demonstrate tangible returns, it's going to be hard for me. And I don't really necessarily want to do it as just whatever the funder asked. I think I really need to sort of change the whole thing. So how do I get people enthused? How do they actually understand what data is? How do we collect it and use it every day? And then I thought she was very good in terms of being vulnerable and to say, so what exactly is R? Right? I've heard of these other things, but what's R? And what's gamification? And it really brings to very clear and concrete life, how can data for good actually be made real? So that was a really interesting, thank you for bringing them in. That was
Absolutely, and they both said, I spoke to them afterwards, they each have about a half dozen participants who are really psyched about continuing to work with them, which is the best takeaway there could possibly be.
Fabulous, fabulous. And our last session, which ended just minutes ago, I'm impressed you got down here fast enough, was on the 2020 census, and was a really interesting conversation. And Erica Matsumoto, who's the head of partnerships at the New York City Media Lab, is going to talk us through that one.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, just Susan, thank you for having us here. We're really excited to share. I have some real-time notes, so apologies. I'll be reading off of these a bit. But to clarify, the workshop was led by our executive director, Justin Hendricks, Mark Hansen from Columbia's Journalism School and the Brown Institute for Media Innovation, as well as Lorena Molina Irazi from the Census Open Innovation Lab. So just to give them a quick shout out. The 3 topics that we covered during our workshop as it pertains to the upcoming 2020 census were misinformation and disinformation, how we can address that, working with local journalists to leverage data stories and address the trust issues between the government and its residents and citizens, as well as reaching how to count populations. And so some themes that really surfaced were really the trust issues between the federal government and its residents and citizens. So really looking at new approaches to awareness and education campaigns, new tools and technologies to really address hard to count populations. So are there solutions that can address new tools for translation, language barriers, as well as really raising the awareness for individuals to understand the relationship between the Census 2020 count and issues like redistricting and what it means for our electoral system.
Thank you very much. And it was this idea, is Mark Hansen in the room? Mark?
He might still be upstairs.
He's probably still upstairs, right. So he had this great quote of expressing frustration in his family because he couldn't get his grandparents to actually fill in a long-form census because they were sort of like, why are they asking us this? And this great phrase of his, data collection starts at home, right? Yeah. How do we go beyond that?
Yeah.
So it was a great session. So thank you. Let's give a round of applause. These guys worked really hard. And again, thank you to all the people who joined those workshops and for being open and for contributing your thoughts and raising your hands and really engaging. Those were very, very energizing, great sessions. And I wanted to start the ball rolling in terms of the themes we heard across, but one of the themes that really came out in your workshop around census and came up sort of consistently was this question around equity. Whether it was equity about underserved communities, and so do we do it by language, or if this is the first live survey census ever, well, that's great for those of us with smartphones. Anybody in this room not have a smartphone? Right, okay, so that's not true, the general population, right? So how do we make sure it gets accessible to the broader things? But my sense is that issue of equity came up in others. Do you want to start us off in terms of thinking about how that interplayed with your conversations?
Yeah, I mean, if you were in the workshop, I think the second or third slide that I had up on the screen was just this collection of news headlines of algorithms essentially gone wrong and causing equity problems. And those should not be the stories, right? That's what we're trying to solve here, is not have those be the stories anymore, but talk about like how positive changes happen as a result of these wonderful tools going into place. And so we were very deliberate in the toolkit to not take a stand on particular political issues, but rather to say like bias creeps in all kinds of ways, and it's important for you to sort of look at where those are coming from and what those are. Yeah, there's technical bias like data, but there's also historical and cultural and social bias that comes into that. And those play into the themes of equity that I think are incredibly important. You might argue that part of the reason why we even created the toolkit in the first place was in a response to sort of this growing challenge.
Around issues of equity and bias. Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, just geographically, Corona is, I don't know which way we're facing, but it's, just,
That way.
yeah, it's just there in Queens. And $2.75, right, could get you here outside the door. However, there is this data divide, as it's been called, that we're really seeking to narrow, which, easy to say, much harder to do. And
How would you define the data divide?
so if we're looking at the community of Corona, which is, Corona has been first stop for immigrants for, many, many decades. It now is largely Hispanic from South and Central America, largely non-native born, English speakers. Most of the community, or let's say lots of them, not college, but even, not necessarily high school graduates, but they're high aspirational families as far as futures for their kids. However, again, getting them from, that aspiration to the workplace today that's highly focused on data skills, it's a huge gap, right? And that's the data divide. And hearing from a community-based organization like we did in our workshop, who's working on the front lines with this community, they also are in the data divide. And they've been around for 53 years. They're the recipient of a lot of funding and support, but even they couldn't access the incredible skills that are in this room, right? And that's part of the reason why the workshop came about and that they found it valuable. So, it's data equity, not, as far as for families with young kids thinking about their children's futures, maybe also reskilling or upskilling, as some call it, for their own lives, adults, but also for people in the community-based organization world who also feel that they are somewhat separate from the kind of expertise that we have in this room. So, it's data equity across the board. The need is across the board.
Jake, equity came up. Any comments on that? How do you think that overlays with that sort of future view that we took?
Yeah, one of the downsides of the format of the panel or workshop was that we didn't get to go as deep into many things. We went very broad, but I'll give my own spin on this, so it's just my 2 cents. The vision of saying data for good 2025, in my mind, is saying we're in a spot where humanitarian challenges are where they can be tackled with data science or machine learning are done so ethically and capably. And thinking about a world like that means that capacity has to live in the places where the problems are and the people are. And I think so often when we say data for good, what I hear a lot of the examples of are how can we use data we have for others, in a sense, right? And it's that old Burundian quote, right? It was like, what you do for me without me, you do to me. And so, you've got data scientists who largely represent, or functions of systemic and institutional bias, often represent, skew a certain way, looking to specify, largely white, largely male, largely Western. So saying, like, how can we use these? How can tech companies give what they have? And again, I don't think that's necessarily bad. Then you start to get into a question of, like, philanthropy in general, right? Like, donate, the very controversial question of how to do that in ways that are respectful or equitable. That's, to me, where I think the diversity conversation, equity conversation comes in, is saying, how do we move from a world of how do we who have been privileged to have these things figure out how to give them to others in a way, and more of how is this just the sub-fabric of the way society runs well? How do local communities have the same capacities for their own challenges? Now, there's a lot of, big gap between today and there. I could, expound on some of the things we've seen working well, but I think that's maybe the first thing to get out of the mindset of is like moving beyond how can my company sort of like ride in on the, as a white knight and help this problem, though there's probably a lot of good that could be done, and think more about how can we create an ecosystem where people have this capacity on the ground, first and foremost. Which also, now I'm just tagging on, I think I also want to emphasize the difference between maybe like corporate, in terms of equity, like corporate machine learning power versus nonprofit. There's this sense still of like, those nonprofits could tap into corporate. That's great, but like, we're talking about a technology that by all accounts, whether it's data or machine learning, is one of the most human systems you could think of. It's digital data about us. It's for our better angels of our nature. How do we move from the paradigm of how do like corporate and tech work on these things to how do we lead in the social sector with data science and machine learning? How do we think about ending food scarcity first? So I think I'm rambling a little bit, but I think there's a lot of realms of today's state where because there is already systemic inequity, Data for Good mirrors that, and how do we start working to unravel some of those things? Not easy, but that's how I hear that lens.
So one of the themes that comes out of that is the question around data literacy. Because in the absence of literacy around it, that utopia you described just ain't going to happen.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah, I think.
But it came up, I think, in probably all of our conversations at different angles. Do you want to talk to that, to sort of the issues around literacy, data literacy that came up within the context of government and the applications of your tool?
Yeah, I'm going to have to think outside the box a little bit compared to what we actually talked about inside the session. But I think the notion that sort of a typical middle manager in government, expecting them to have some knowledge of how powerful the data really is, or what algorithms can do to either help or harm them, is maybe a little bit unrealistic. And so that's, I think, the divide that we're trying to close, right? So how do we sort of empower them, not to say I'll never use an algorithm ever, because in my opinion, that's just an inescapable conclusion, but rather I have a tool set that I can use to be responsible with this power. With this great power comes great responsibility. I'm going to chase down your superhero quote.
Please. Go on.
So yeah, I mean,
Your group actually had the best definition of algorithms I've heard for a long time. Do you remember that one?
it was a set of processes, a set of steps.
Step-by-step recipe.
Yeah.
All an algorithm is a step-by-step recipe, which actually was what your whole sort of toolkit was.
Yeah, actually, now you're triggering me for a quote that we actually had, which was that our toolkit is also an algorithm, and we should be mindful of that.
Which was really interesting. Exactly right. Exactly right. Do you want to speak to that one, Catherine?
Yes, I do, given that I think, as I said when I was talking about where the workshop came out of is out of this work having to do with data literacy, which grew out of work that I had done when I was at the New York Hall of Science, along with several other people, on network literacy. And this idea of domain-based literacy is, on the one hand, necessary and a good way to approach it from an educational standpoint. But what's different about data is that it's not really about domain science. I mean, at least the way we see it, it's more, it's in all of our lives, right? And so data literacy, the reason it's not just data scientists who need to be data literate, it's not even just workers who need to be data literate, it's all of us, because it's whether somebody's changing their diaper. I couldn't really see the video, so I don't know what that was actually about, but I heard it. Or whatever it is, day in, day out, from the moment we get up and look at the weather, we are surrounded by it, and if we don't understand what we're seeing, how it's affecting us, how our information is being used, what's ethical, what's fair, we can't really proceed in this world. And this, of course, is the underpinning of where this work is going. And most recently, we have been having conversations that grew out of a PI meeting at the National Science Foundation about maybe calling it data science for all. The thing about the word literacy, I mean, we've been involved in these other literacy projects, initiatives, which have been very successful. The thing about the word literacy is sometimes people feel it's somewhat kind of burdensome or something. And really what we're talking about is how data science is for all and can be used for all. So this is in sort of in flux right now. This is kind of how we're thinking about it, and was clearly the motivating force behind the workshop that we were fortunate to be able to have today.
So one of the themes that really came out was this question about trust, which was explicit in your workshop and probably implicit in many of the other conversations. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think when it comes to the topic of the census, I think when it, a lot of people I think don't quite ties into data literacy perhaps, or even just awareness about addressing misinformation and disinformation. But I think a theme that was repeated time and time again was the trust issue between, and misinformation regarding the census, and trust between our federal government, staying apolitical and non-biased about it, but generally speaking, the census is aimed to count residents, not necessarily citizens. So there's a lot of misunderstanding around that, and as a result, many people would be hesitant to take part in a census because there are concerns around if this information is, if the government has information about me, what will they do with it? One, and then two, what are some privacy and security concerns that we have given cybersecurity sort of concerns and issues and other global trends that we're seeing in the news? And so I think it's a twofold concern. One is how will the government take my information, and then two, how will the government protect and keep my information safe?
It was a really interesting conversation about that. We didn't use the trust didn't come up in any of the other conversations, but it did seem to be it was part of the reason why you needed to have the literacy in order to establish a trust. You need to understand how your data was going to be used. Do you want to pick up on that one, Jake?
Yeah, sure. I think we heard a lot of folks talking about basically, to that point, trust building through understanding what data science can or can't do, trust building through knowing how data was not going to be used, or of course how the algorithm ultimately ended up working. So I'll probably just end up +1ing a lot of what Catherine said, that I think in this stage, like you need to have that basic literacy in order to have trust. And I think this is just, again, maybe my own 2 cents. Literacy, if you're literate, like if you can truly read, like it doesn't also mean you're a great writer. And so I think that sometimes data literacy gets conflated with everyone needs to become a data scientist. And I think just having the baseline ability to navigate the kinds of things Catherine was mentioning is sort of what we're aiming for, because then we can create these more trust-built systems. So yeah.
So let's turn to the final topic, which is, based on today, based on your respective workshops and any other sessions that you've listened to, what are sort of the top 3 either opportunities or barriers, challenges that you expect to sort of be facing in the next couple of years? Let's start with you.
So I think this is probably the appropriate time to announce another sort of partner that we've brought into the equation. So we're really excited to be sort of connecting with Data for Democracy, and thank you, Mo, for all your support over the last few weeks as we've been pulling this together. Because our goal is not just to have the toolkit live in the government realm, but also to live in other verticals, academic, nonprofits, private sector, and so on. That also probably bears mentioning that the toolkit is actually released under a Creative Commons license, so we want people to kind of treat it like an open source instrument, and if we were capable of receiving pull requests for it in the format that it is right now, we would absolutely do so. So I think one path is just sort of like getting the toolkit to spread into other places. Our mission is going to be to work with the governments that we work with now, or with other governments that are really interested in it, and help them apply it in practice. But also to encourage people to realize that it's not a end-all, be-all. It's not a thing. It doesn't create trust on its own, just to sort of dovetail into the last conversation. But it is an ongoing dialogue. It is something that requires continual, sort of looking at, reevaluating. It requires bringing in people from the community to understand sort of where the impacts are and where they're happening, where the good impacts are happening, but also where the bad impacts are happening. So I think we have sort of a really huge future for the toolkit, to be perfectly honest with you, and I can see it going 10 million ways, and I'm excited for all of them, and I'm excited to actually see what other people do if they take the work and expand it out into other places, and being able to bring the best ideas from those back in and improve it for the work that we're doing with governments would be like amazing.
So just to give you a chance to, to your own, what is the URL that this room can look at to see the toolkit?
It's super easy. It's ethicstoolkit.ai.
Ethicstoolkit.ai. Good, thank you. All right, so it's about going broad, figuring out ways to go broad, figuring out how to apply it in practice and iterate, and how to keep it real. Great, thank you. Catherine.
First of all, to quote Roy Scheider, we're going to need a bigger boat, bigger room. I think all 4 workshops were, over capacity. Clearly, the excitement and the motivation is there. One kind of happy consequences of us not being able to get into Jake's workshop was Steve, Johnny, and I went and sat in the lunchroom and actually put our money where our mouths are and bought ds4all.org, right?
Nice.
Right, DS4, we stole your 4, DS numeral 4 all.org. This just happened literally whenever that was, 12:30, and yeah, happened here. So there's nothing there yet, but to come. And just the level of excitement, and what Saida said, the executive director of Elm Corps, she said she knows of lots of other community-based organizations who would love to have these conversations. And for a lot of us, most of us probably who are on the other side of the table, the data scientists, the data analysts, who are always looking for community-based or other partners to work with. I think there's a lot of work being done there, but I think just, based on what she said, there's a lot of other potential partnerships out there that want to get connected with the people in this room, which is exciting, and I know she's going to go back to her office and tell everybody all about it.
So other possibilities for this platform, today's platform, and getting a bigger boat. Excellent. Erica.
Yes. I think I would just echo what my fellow panelists have said. I think what I found really encouraging was really collaborating across various sectors, so universities, nonprofits, governments, and for-profit companies, and I think staying really focused on the impact that we want to see, and staying mission-driven and mission-aligned.
Jake.
+1 as well. And gotta say, man, huge thanks to everyone that was in our workshop. I have to say, the goal is to kind of recapture the early conversations. I felt like y'all went above and beyond. Like, the energy was huge in that room. The number of ideas was certainly not lacking. And I saw a number of people coming up afterwards and saying, hey, here's how we'd like to work either with DataKind or these people across the room. So just echoing again everything what people are saying, that the collaboration and the energy around this is huge. And it's really the only way I think we're going to go to this next level, which is what we're excited about, of trying to actually kind of weave these worlds together. Like, what, the question that's facing us at DataKind is, if we could look back over the last 6 years of running volunteer projects, what's the next thing, right? We don't want that to go away, but like, social change shouldn't be built on the backs of drips and drops of volunteerism. Like, there's something very broken with our world if that's what we're doing. Again, not to discourage volunteers, like, please get out there, like, we should all continue that going, but there should be something to follow. And so we're very excited to be digging into the ways that the work that we're doing and others in the space are doing could actually maybe push a conversation to funders about what should they be funding for nonprofits, because they're not sure what is needed in data science. We're very, very honored that the Rockefeller Foundation has given us a planning grant to talk about this very topic and sponsor this workshop to say, what does the world of 2025 look like and what should we do moving forward? So this is an open invitation to people. If we can be supportive of this data for good ecosystem, let us know. This is what we're looking to do. There's more on our blog, datakind.org/blog. It's one of the articles there. If you want to be a part of that process, if you liked the workshop, or if you just hear this and go, hey, I want to be a part of that next thing, reach out to us. Contact@datakind.org. We're going to be putting together committees and groups. And no matter what you're doing, with us or otherwise, we just want to cheer it on because there's obviously so much energy here. A lot of great things are going to happen thanks to you all in the room.
Thank you. And that's a great way to close this session. You know, when we started, and many of the people in this room were the folks who started this platform in 2014. We started it as a KDD at Bloomberg. And we didn't really know if anybody would actually show up, right? We truly had no clue. And we had well over 500 people join us that very first year. And it's wonderful that now, this is our 5th year in doing it, that the conversation continues to strengthen. The challenges haven't gone away. You know, let's not delude ourselves. But at the same time, the value of data for good has become unbelievably reaffirmed. And the fact that folks wanted to go to the workshops where you rolled up your sleeves, you know, and it wasn't just a lecture, right? You actually had to engage in the conversation, I think is one of our most encouraging points. So thank you to our sessions. Thank you to all the people who helped those workshops. And thanks to everyone in the room.